students, I'll be talking on hypertensive disorders in pregnancy. Hypertensive disorders complicates almost 10% of all pregnancies. It is responsible for 16% of maternal mortality in developing countries. It is the commonest cause of iatrogenic prematurity, accounting for 15% of all premature births and 20% of very low birth weight. So, what is hypertension in pregnancy? So, when the systolic BP is over 140 mm of mercury and or the diastolic BP is above 90 mm of mercury, which should be documented on at least 2 occasions, at least 6 hours apart, but not more than 7 days apart. So, the diastolic blood pressure is the point of disappearance of the sounds, that is Korotkov 5 sound is taken. The earlier definition, that is the rise in systolic BP by 30 mm of mercury and the rise of the diastolic BP by 15 mm of mercury, is no longer taken in the definition criteria. So how do we classify hypertension in pregnancy? So basically there are 5 categories: gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, eclampsia, chronic hypertension, preeclampsia or eclampsia superimposed on chronic hypertension. Now we should know what is this term, significant proteinuria. So when the urine excretion is more than or equal to 300 milligrams in 24-hour urine, or when by a dipstick test it is more than or equal to 1 plus, that is more than 0.3, more than or equal to 0.3 grams per liter, or the urine protein by creatinine ratio is more than 0.3 into random urine samples collected at least 4 hours apart in the absence of urinary tract infection. Now coming to the different categories. So what is gestational hypertension? It is new onset of hypertension after 20 weeks of pregnancy without proteinuria, which returns to normal within 12 weeks postpartum. What is preeclampsia? It is gestational hypertension along with proteinuria. What is eclampsia? It is preeclampsia along with seizures or convulsions or coma. What is chronic hypertension? It is hypertension that is present before pregnancy or diagnosed before 20 weeks of pregnancy, but not due to gestational trophoblastic disease, or any hypertension that is diagnosed after 20 weeks, but it is persistent even after 12 weeks postpartum. So in this case, it is a retrospective diagnosis. The 5th category is superimposed preeclampsia on chronic hypertension. So when there are one or more features of preeclampsia which develop for the first time during pregnancy after 20 weeks of pregnancy in a woman with pre-existing chronic hypertension. Coming to the risk factors, so there are certain couple-related risk factors like primary paternity or pregnancy after donor insemination or use of donor egg or embryo, pre-existing medical conditions like pregestational diabetes, chronic hypertension, renal disease, maternal immunological diseases, pre-existing thrombophilia or antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, maternal or pregnancy associated risk factors like extremes of age, obesity, insulin resistance or gestational diabetes, smoking, multiple pregnancies, preeclampsia in previous pregnancy or family history of preeclampsia. Coming to the 2-stage model of preeclampsia. So in the first stage there is defective placental implantation. And the second stage is the development of the maternal syndrome, that is hypertension, proteinuria and endothelial dysfunction. So it is believed that the primary pathology is defective placental implantation, which ultimately leads to the development of preeclampsia. So it may be in the form of abnormal implantation, it may be associated with microvascular diseases like diabetes or hypertension, or there may be large placentas as in hydrops, multiple pregnancy or aged mole. So what happens in normal pregnancy? The placenta goes and invades the decidua and the myometrium. So the normal endovascular invasion of the cytotrophoblast into the spiral arteries in preeclampsia fails to occur beyond the decidua myometrial junction. So normally what happens, there is remodeling of the spiral arteries. they are converted into tortuous vessels, but this procedure fails to occur in a preeclamptic case. So this may result to placental hypoxia, immunological factors may be involved, placental enzymes may be involved, genetic factors or oxidative stress. And as I have mentioned, the maternal syndrome, there is hypertension, proteinuria. Also, there is involvement of other endocrines. So what is the normal physiology of maintaining uteroplacental flow in normal pregnancy? So the placenta releases angiotensinase, which causes destruction of angiotensin II, which being a potent vasoconstrictor, and because of damage of this angiotensin II, the blood pressure is stabilized. Then there is synthesis of prostacyclin, that is PGI2, and nitric oxide in excess in normal pregnancy, which causes vasodilatation, leading to stabilization of the blood pressure. Also, there is release of vascular endothelial growth factor, which restores the uteroplacental flow. So the normal balance of agonist and antagonistic factors is there in normal pregnancy. That is vasodilators and vasoconstrictors. Also angiogenic and anti-angiogenic factors are in proper balance. So vasodilators include nitric oxide and prostacyclins. Vasoconstrictors include angiotensin II and endothelin 1. Again, angiogenic factors include VEGF, TGF-beta, and placental growth factor. Anti-angiogenic factors include SFLT1 and SENG. So what is the possible mechanism of action? So I have already mentioned that there is abnormal cytotrophoblast invasion. This leads to decreased uteroplacental blood flow, leading to placental ischemia. There is placental release of cytokine factors, which leads to endothelial dysfunction. So there is increase in vasoconstrictors like endothelin and thromboxane A2. There is decrease in vasodilators like prostacyclin and nitric oxide, and there is increased sensitivity to angiotensin, leading to lowered renal pressure, natriuresis, and development of hypertension. Pathophysiology of the other organs are, because of decreased uteroplacental flow, there may be development of fetal IUGR, hematological abnormalities like epistaxis, hemoconcentration, DIC-like features. In the CNS, cerebral edema, cerebral hemorrhage may be seen. Then in the heart, subendothelial hemorrhage, focal necrosis and hemorrhage, cardiomyopathy, sometimes even heart failure. In the lungs, development of pulmonary edema, hemorrhagic bronchopneumonia. In the kidneys, glomerular endotheliosis, reduced urine output. And in the liver, subcapsular hemorrhage, ischemia, periportal necrosis, and development of HELLP syndrome. The incidence is around 2 to 7% in healthy nulliparous women. So we basically divide it into preeclampsia into two types, mild and severe. Mild is when the BP is less than or equal to 160/100, and severe is when the diastolic BP is over 110 and systolic is over 160 mm of mercury. This should be documented on at least 2 occasions along with significant proteinuria. Now in severe eclampsia, there may be several other features like oliguria, cerebral visual disturbances, epigastric pain, nausea, vomiting, pulmonary edema, impaired liver function, thrombocytopenia, then convulsions, so patient develops eclampsia in such cases, and fetal growth restriction. So when we take the history, the patient particulars, patients are usually of extremes of age, either they are too young or too old. Mostly they are nulliparous. They usually come with complaints of swelling of legs or other parts of the body. In severe disease, they may present with headache, visual disturbances, nausea, vomiting, abdominal or epigastric pain, oliguria, insomnia, vaginal bleeding or seizures. We have to take a detailed obstetric history, both the present and the past obstetric history, regarding use of any hypertensive disorders, use of antihypertensives, then presence of pre-existing hypertension, renal disease, diabetes, thrombophilia, thyroid disorders. Then family history has to be thoroughly taken. Then we have to go for examination of the patient. So most of the ladies may be obese. Then increased weight gain is a very prominent feature. So if the weight gain is at the rate of more than 1 pound a week or more than 5 pounds a month, particularly in the later months of pregnancy. Then edema, that is pathological edema, it's not physiological edema. That is when it is demonstrable over the ankles even after a bed rest of 12 hours. Then the pulse and the blood pressure has to be noted. We have to auscultate the heart to look for the rate, rhythm, presence of any murmurs, when it is splitting. Then eye examination is also important because there may be evidence of retinal hemorrhage, nicking of veins, and alteration of the arterial vein ratio. Then if we go for the deep tendon reflexes, we may find hyperreflexia or presence of weakness. Next we come to the investigations. So urine dipstick testing is very important to look for proteinuria. We may go for 24 urine collection even. And blood examination, total count is done, differential count, peripheral smear, hemoglobin, BTCT, serum urea, creatinine, electrolytes, uric acid, liver function test to look for the liver enzymes. Fetal investigations like cardiotocography and USG scan to look for the growth, amniotic fluid volume, and Doppler study. So our differential diagnosis will include pre-existing hypertension, the new or gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, eclampsia, exacerbation of underlying renal disease or superimposed preeclampsia or eclampsia, and SLE. Differential diagnosis of eclampsia includes epilepsy, intracranial hemorrhage or thrombosis, meningitis, cerebral malaria, amniotic fluid embolism, etc. What are the complications of preeclampsia? So immediate complications in the mother during pregnancy include eclampsia, accidental hemorrhage, oliguria, diminished vision, HELLP syndrome, cerebral hemorrhage, and development of ARDS. During labor, again eclampsia or postpartum hemorrhage, and during the puerperium period, she may have eclampsia, shock, sepsis. Fetal complications are fetal growth restriction, IUD, asphyxia, or prematurity. Remote complications include residual hypertension, recurrent preeclampsia, chronic renal disease. Complications of eclampsia, so maternal complications, so there is risk of maternal injuries like tongue bite, injuries due to fall, or bed sore. Systemic complications like pulmonary edema, pneumonia, ARDS, and embolism. There may be acute left ventricular failure, renal failure, hepatic necrosis or subcapsular hematoma, cerebral hemorrhage, cerebral edema, diminished vision due to retinal detachment or occipital lobe ischemia. There may be low platelet count, features of DIC may also be there. Postpartum complications like shock, sepsis, and development of psychosis. Fetal complications are asphyxia, prematurity, hypoxia, and IUD. What is HELLP syndrome? It is an acronym for hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, and low platelet count. It is a rare multi-system disorder that complicates pregnancy with laboratory evidences of microangiopathic hemolysis, hepatic dysfunction, and development of thrombocytopenia. It is commonly associated with preeclampsia, but sometimes it may be rarely diagnosed in the absence of these disorders. So what are the criteria for diagnosis of HELLP syndrome? So clinical features, patient may complain of epigastric or right upper quadrant pain. There may be nausea or vomiting. So we'll have to go for laboratory investigations to establish a diagnosis. So for hemolysis, the LDH level gets raised, it becomes more than 600 international units per liter. There is low serum haptoglobin, high serum bilirubin, abnormal peripheral smear like presence of cystocytes or Burr cells, and in the later period patient may have low hemoglobin level. Then elevated liver enzymes are seen and platelet count is usually less than 1 lakh per cubic mm of blood. Coming to the management. So management depends on the severity of disease, the maturity of the fetus, that is the gestational age, and the condition of the cervix. So we have to decide whether we are going for inpatient or outpatient management. Outpatient management is appropriate if the patient suffers for gestational hypertension without severe features or preeclampsia without severe features. But inpatient management is required if she has severe preeclampsia or there is poor adherence to monitoring recommendations. How to measure the blood pressure? We need the appropriate cuff size, that is 1.5 times the upper arm circumference. During that period, patient should not be avoiding tobacco or caffeine intake. She should be in upright position after a 10-minute rest period, and measurement may be taken either in sitting or left lateral recumbent position with arm at the level of the heart. Now, how do we go for outpatient assessment? So for fetal assessment, it is done ideally every 3 to 4 weeks, or if required even more frequently. So we go for amniotic fluid assessment and antenatal testing like non-stress test and biophysical profile. So maternal assessment, basically we go for the laboratory investigations, preferably weekly or more frequently if the patient's status is deteriorating. So laboratory investigations like serum creatinine, liver enzymes, platelet count, and also proteinuria to establish that it is a case of preeclampsia. And she should be asked to come for frequent visits, at least once every week. In every visit, we have to see at least the blood pressure and evaluate her for presence of severe features. Already I have mentioned about the candidates for expectant management. So like patients who have gestational hypertension or preeclampsia without severe features, who are less than 37 weeks of pregnancy, having reassuring antenatal testing, there is no evidence of draining per vagina or bleeding per vagina or any evidence of patient going into labor. But in some cases, we have to consider her for delivery. So these are in the cases with severe range hypertension, particularly those who are not responding to our antihypertensive treatment. Patients suffering from persistent headache, or persistent epigastric pain or right upper quadrant pain, visual disturbance, development of MI or stroke, HELLP syndrome, worsening renal function, pulmonary edema, eclampsia, abruptio placentae. There is abnormal antenatal testing, is fetal death or any fetal anomalies detected, or there is abnormality in the Doppler study, particularly if there is reverse end diastolic flow. So how do we go for expectant management in a case of severe preeclampsia? So here the decision making is very difficult. We have to consider both the risk and the benefits, and proper patient counseling is also required. So the risk of expectant management is the patient may develop complications like pulmonary edema, MI, stroke, ARDS, coagulopathy, renal failure, retinal injury. So in a case of severe preeclampsia, if she has crossed 34 weeks, then it is always better to recommend delivery. But less than 34 weeks, we may go for expectant management, particularly if the patient is stable at that moment. So what are the advantages of going for expectant management? We will have a better neonatal outcome, but at the same time, close monitoring is very important. Both the maternal status and the fetal status are to be monitored. If at any time either of the two deteriorates, then we have to consider delivery. Corticosteroid administration is recommended to delay delivery whenever indicated to bring about fetal lung maturity. Daily weight and urine output measurement, antihypertensive treatment, use of steroids, then laboratory investigations every other day or more frequently if required, then the daily fetal movement count, then weekly to as frequently as daily non-stress stress depending upon the fetal growth status and LICA, Then the Doppler study twice a week, amniotic fluid volume twice a week, and ultrasound for fetal growth every 2 weeks. What are the commonly used antihypertensive agents in pregnancy? So we use centrally acting methyl dopa, then adenoceptor blocker, labetalol, and calcium channel blockers like nifedipine. So vaginal delivery should be considered in any hypertensive disorder in pregnancy unless cesarean section is required for the usual obstetric indications. The antihypertensives are continued throughout labor so as to maintain the blood pressure less than 160 by 110 of mercury. The third stage has to be managed actively with oxytocin 10 units IM immediately after delivery of the baby. Argometrin should not be given. Now, in a case of severe preeclampsia as well as in a case of eclampsia, we use magnesium sulfate, which is an anticonvulsant. The regime that we follow here in our institution is the pre-charged regime. So here we use a loading dose of 14 gram of magnesium sulfate. That is 4 grams of 20% solution is used. It is given IV slowly, followed by 5 grams IM on both buttocks, which is a 50% solution. Then the patient is given maintenance dose of 5 grams of magnesium sulfate. Again, this is a 50% solution, which is given every 4 hourly on alternate buttocks. Whenever we are giving magnesium sulfate, we have to monitor the patient because it may cause toxicity. So what are the things to be monitored? Basically, we have to look for the urine output, which should be at least 30 ml per hour or 100 ml in 4 hours. Deep tendon reflexes should be present. Respiratory rate should be above 14 per minute. And we can also look for the pulse oximetry. Magnesium sulfate is continued up to 24 hours after delivery or after the last convulsion, whichever is later. Now, management of a case of eclampsia. So ideally, the patient should be managed in an eclampsia room, which is a separate room which is dark. The patient has to be given protection and supportive care during a phase of convulsion. Magnesium sulfate has to be started. Also, antihypertensives are to be given judiciously. IV fluid is to be limited. We should try to avoid diuretics and any hyperosmotic agents. And then we have to take prompt steps for delivery of the fetus. Now, when a seizure is occurring, we should not try to stop the seizure, but we should try to put an oral airway without causing trauma to the mouth and teeth. We should go for suctioning of the oral secretions, give her oxygen at the rate of 8 to 10 liters per minute. The bedside rails are to be elevated and padded to avoid any injury to the mother. Pulse oximetry is used to monitor development of hypoxemia. And once the seizure ends, we can start slow IV fluid at the rate of 125 ml per hour. Then magnesium sulfate has to be continued, and also the blood pressure has to be monitored. We can start with an IV bolus dose of labetalol 20 mg initially, then which can be again gradually escalated like 40 mg and then 80 mg at 15-minute interval until the blood pressure is in the desired range. If magnesium toxicity is suspected, magnesium infusion should be discontinued. Oxygen supplementation is administered. If possible, we should do a serum magnesium level, and we should use the antidote for magnesium sulfate, that is 10% calcium gluconate. 10 ml is given as a slow IV push. Thank you.